to focus specifically on the three questions that we had sort of looked at and done a little bit of feedback on before. The aim being to kind of refine and make sure that we're happy with those three questions to then go into a specific work stream with others involved. So the obvious party that I can think of is, for example, procurement, to actually get to the nitty gritty of the questions that we raised, to try and see how we could unlock it, or whether there's still obviously barriers within the industry that just means that it's going to be a bit more of a struggle still in order to get the ideal workflow, let's say, which is what we're trying to, I guess, aim for. So what I've done is I've taken those three questions. I've kind of collated the feedback that I've had from Mark, for example, from Jarek, and then we'll just see how we get on. And I think if we're generally there or thereabouts in terms of our questions and our queries, and obviously the output of each of the questions, then I think that's all we need to do today. And then I guess, George, it's a case of then figuring out who do we share this and who would be the best people to be in that work stream, to then get some sort of answers, a conclusion to these three questions that we posed. Does that sound sensible, everyone? Does that make clear?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, what I'll do, I'll share my screen and then we can crack on. So the first one was the project delivery program, and essentially this is about I'll kind of read it a little bit. Shall I just make that a little bit bigger so everyone, that helps everyone read it? So the various sort of workshops that we've had, the early engagement of consultants, designers, contractors, etc. But what the issue there was about, is it actually possible to realise the following, which is sort of noted in that guidance that was shared. And I think, Mark, obviously you kind of made a good point in terms of the engagement of specialists at the PCSA stage.
Yeah.
But there's a difference, as you rightly kind of pointed out, between design and then actually sort of just general kind of input, and something that someone would actually stand by. So
the way I put it to, there was a conversation with someone, a supplier recently, and we were talking about engagement. I said, but the problem with engagement is people tend to be in sales mode. It's not real put your what's it on the block design as such. So I think we need to definitely differentiate between those two. But for me, it's about the actual design.
And I think Jarek, you made a very good point about, I think somewhere in your comments, so I've sort of like just kind of collated some of them. It was about, as a minimum, kind of agreeing the zonal, at least the spatial kind of zonal requirements, and getting that level of input as early as possible. Again, I guess we've had it in the past where we've agreed zonal requirements, let's say ceiling voids, but unfortunately, inevitably, and a piece of equipment get changed. I've got that currently on a project where the piece of equipment got changed, and therefore the ceilings are going to have to get lower. So even when we thought we had agreed the spatial strategy, financial or product constraints have now kind of caused a change in that. So I think the key thing that are coming from this first part of the question is about how, I think what I made a note here is, how do we actually get design? From what I can see, really, it's in that PCSA period is about the client also understanding that in order to de-risk the project, both spatially and I guess product based, there is probably most likely going to have to be some additional fees that they're going to have to expend, which they're not going to necessarily want to hear, but I don't really know how else to try and alleviate this. But I think that's part of the question that we can ask the procurement/client team.
For me, it goes slightly deeper than that with certain elements as well. So if we're talking about engaging with specialist subcontractors to unlock the specialist information, then from their point of view, there's two elements to the price. There's the design, and then there's the much larger actually doing the work, installation. And there are certain aspects where you may just say engage, I don't know, a £300,000 design package as such, but yet the overall supply would be 10, 15 million pounds. And there's a problem then if you don't end up procuring through that same specialist subcontractor. And I've been caught out on this before, because there's not always one answer to a problem, and you'll have someone else turn up and say, well, actually, no, this is how we would have done it. And before you know it, you're going through a change process with your design. If that made sense to everybody.
It does, Mark.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, probably a good way to look at it, because I know we talking about the, I love the thing ringing in my ears, Mark. I love it. It's brilliant. It's cracking me up. But the thing is, you know, it's we were talking the other group a while ago, Mark, is when you look at all the consultants needs for architecture, they're the coordinator of the systems of others. So if you don't know the bit of kit, hence your comment there, Andrew, that goes in, and you say, well, it's changed. The fact is it probably never worked properly in the first place. The same problem was prevalent because the product was never selected. And Mark's right in what you're saying is that if you change products, there's things that would have been the issue in the first place. But actually, if you didn't have a product in the first place, you still got the same problem no matter what. So you need the specific product to unlock it all, because the wall is a system of ducts, dampers, doors, and they've all got different requirements to install them. It's that bit that needs to be coordinated. So it's how you bring all of those specialist parts together in one hit, because one will affect the other. Does that make sense? You know? Trying to explain it in a different way, Mark, but probably not doing very well.
but then, you know, look at it from the client's point of view. It's how much, what's their cash flow like before financial close. And of course, if I'm sitting as a client, I want to minimize my exposure and push my cash flow to the other side of that line. But in reality, to do the job right, that cash flow needs to be earlier in varying degrees depending on your approach to risk.
But it's not just to do with cash flow, it's to do with risk.
Yes.
Most clients have opted for years now for D&B because they want to de-risk their own side of things, right? So yeah. Absolutely. So basically, there's a reason, there's a commercial and design risk reason why suppliers are not brought on early. Yeah.
Yeah.
So because first of all, you might pay for something that you're not going to use. Number one, you might also make decisions that you don't need late. You might make them early, and then you realize you made them for nothing because actually the whole thing has changed. Yeah. So bringing supply chain early, it only works if you are absolutely determined that you're going to be able to specify a certain system, and a certain, let's say, in an entire prefabricated system can be specified. That makes sense, yeah. So you say we're going to absolutely go to Porter Cabin for this, or we're going to go to Techrete, who cast amazing big concrete slabs, yeah, and we're going to stick to Techrete, and therefore we're going to develop all of our detailing to fit that system. That makes sense, and you can bring the supplier on board at stage 3 and work with them and develop your models with them and everything. Everything else, all the bits, other bits that buildings are made of, there's no point bringing suppliers on early, because you might bring them, you might pay them, they might do loads of work, and you still change everything and you don't use them at the end. Yeah. So it's about commercial decision making. It is not about spending a bit of money to bring suppliers on.
Yeah, it's not just commercial risk though, is it, Anna? So one of the things that we've identified through the workshops, for example, in my simple understanding, is that on compartmentation, by leaving the procurement of the selection of M&E products later in the process, there is a much greater likelihood that the penetration seals are going to be in the wrong place. So therefore, although the cost risk may have been pushed down the line, so the cost risk is mitigated, the safety risk and the risk of quality is going to be increased. So therefore, it's that balance, really, isn't it?
Sorry, can I jump in?
Of course.
So are we really talking about two two items in here so far, from what I can tell. Engagement of the specialist, whatever that means, and then the volume strategy and related outcomes of lacking if we haven't got a volume strategy. So the space is not sufficient for the, let's say, MEP services. I guess that's what we've just been discussing. This is all then related to procurement. Someone mentioned a specialist onboarding for right reasons. It would be too early to get the specialist, but what I think the advice client needs, he needs the client side consultant engaged early to basically be responsible for checking what assumptions have been made, what constraints have been established, and whether at any given stage those assumptions and constraints are still valid, have been followed or not, and if not, flag them up so it can be actioned. So if let's say, because there's a specific rule of thumb, let's say, generally a ceiling void, everyone would, I think, agree that the maximum ceiling void as a default is 800, because if it's more, or let's say 795, because if it's 800, you will need void detection, which will significantly increase the cost of the whole project. So 795 is the absolute maximum everyone wants to go for. Then you can agree that, say, 150 mil is a lighting zone, measuring from underneath of the ceiling height, and the rest is for other services. If you can't then develop the design at early stage, which would fit within that zone, then you flag it up. But someone needs to be responsible for flagging it up to represent clients' needs. And it's nothing to do with the specialist. Yes, it would be too early to have them engaged so quickly. It would be a waste of money. But there is some general rules which have to be established and controlled. And if something doesn't work within those constraints, it needs to be then flagged up and then something done about it. Sorry.
I totally agree with you, but then, and I'm bound to be controversial here and upset people, but when we pick up a so-called spatially coordinated stage 3 design, where you would assume that those assumptions, rules of thumb, whatever, have been applied, it's not unusual to find that when you further develop your building services, actually those assumptions and rules of thumb were wrong, or, being really frank, something's just been manipulated to present itself as a stage 3.
Yeah, and Mark, I mean, just you're absolutely spot on, Mike. You know, our views are completely aligned on this. Is that you have to look at the drivers for a ceiling void, and you know, it's not always what goes into it is in the space of the void. It's actually what transitions into it. So if you go back to your main core and you look at your ventilation, you've got to look at your core design and say, is the core design sufficient to keep everything as tight to the underside as possible? And the minute you've got things like steel beams in there of encapsulation, everything's going under that steel beam, it ain't going through it. And that's where these conflicts come in. And this is why when we talk about specialists, I think, I'm not sure it's the right terminology or not. It's all about, well, it's a combination of the construction of the actual core, the material that's been used, its performance and how it moves and deflects, and the ability of whatever system sits between the two slabs in that shaft, whatever you've got in the core, to let stuff pass through it. And that's where the problem kind of lies, because what you find is, and Mark, you know this yourself, you end up with designs that come out which structurally work, they're very lean, but actually everything that comes out of the core must pass underneath the steel beam. It cannot go through it. So the steel beam just can't be there in the first place, because that's what's driving your void height, not the actual surfaces in the void. It's the interconnecting part that's causing it. And that's a summation of the wall system, the manufacture, the kit that goes in it, and the deflection ability of the wall to take up that movement, not the service, because the wall does it, not the service. That's the problem. That's what we find anyway, if that makes sense. And this is why when you sort of look at the word specialist, you look at, you know, REBA stage 3 for spatial coordination, you sort of say, if an architect's drawing everything out with a services consultant, but it's not based upon products, they've probably got no open hell getting it right in the first place, because the rules are just not generic. it's all based on the service that's been tested in the supporting construction that was appropriate in the test. That's where it sounds a bit geeky, but that's where it all kind of goes back to. We kind of don't. No one sees that interrelationship because you haven't got a door, you haven't got a damper, you haven't got a flue, you haven't got the manufacturers of those kit, you haven't got a wall manufacturer or someone that's actually saying this is actually how we want to build it.
Yeah, agreed.
I know it's slightly trivial, but again, with ceiling heights, even if they're only being moved, say 100 millimeters, can mess up the total calculations for emergency lighting. It can make the escape route signs either too high or too low. So in terms of the changes around these small elements, is trouble on site, and you get fudges and fixes all over the place that theoretically bring about non-conformance.
But that's what I said. If you have agreed volume strategy, and if you agree to void a ceiling height, for example, and if you can't, if there is someone who is controlling it and reports back and is responsible for it, then not only you can flag up issues. Let's say you've got steel beam in a way you didn't know about, and that is flagged up, then you can do something about it. Maybe you just need to create bulkhead underneath. It creates crossover zone. Crossover zones is normal scenario we deal with at any project. But you have to have some kind of base rules, otherwise you will not be able to do anything. And you have to simplify at the initial stage of the project, and then you just add complexity to it. But the biggest problem I find from practical experience is there is no one responsible for it. Apart of everything else, there is no one who actually checks and say, this is wrong or this is right.
No, yeah, it becomes a contractor's problem, just a small contractor's problem. And that's what we were talking about earlier, because the change never goes back to the drawings. No,
it is. It's you know, like if you look at it from the bottom, the middle, and the top, and you see it from the consultant's eyes, there's a big chasm in the middle that gets missed, because, as I think Anna quite rightly says, is that clients' drivers always to de-risk their contract, so they do a contract in such a way they don't be responsible for what even the consultant's drawn in the first place. They're going to palm it off in novation. But the fact is, everyone's drawing around the fact that the supply chain is going to procure, products and kit that goes into it. But if you haven't looked at those products and kit in the first place, then your spatial assumptions will be completely incorrect. You need those products and how they all bolt together as a system to make that call. Because I think even if you look at, you look at voids in offices, that's what we're talking about. The driver's always going to be how things transition out of that riser to get into it in the first place. If that's wrong, then you end up with, I love the word, I do love a bulkhead, I love that word, Jarek, I love it. And all architects love a bulkhead, don't they? That's why you end up with these carbuncles and bulkheads, because the core design is incapable of letting stuff go out tight to the slab because of the movement of the core doesn't allow it in the first place.
Yeah, I may say something controversial again, but I think maybe this is also linked to competency of individuals or companies, the advisors, because science doesn't change the airflow volumes of specified airflow volumes will require a specific size of the duct, which will be known or should be known early. The cable size have certain carrying capacity, and I'll know at early stage how much power or current I need and roughly how big cables I will need and the containments related to it. It's actually something which can be established early, only if you want and if you capable. The problem I find is people either not doing a good job, or they are at the wrong kind of position. They're not capable of doing the job, and no one checks this.
Is it a matter of allocating? I mean, Joe, you've not said anything. I'm quite interested from your perspective. Is that something that, as an architect, might be within your scope?
Well, I kind of chips in on the chat that I kind of totally agree, and I've kind of seen projects with both approaches. So I think the idea of developing a rule book for the design, the basic principles at the start of the design, always pays dividends later on down the line. And I've seen projects that have used that, and then projects that haven't. And it's invariably the projects that haven't where we get more issues, because you don't have that framework to refer back to in terms of the decision making. So it's then a bit of a free for all, isn't it? Whereas I personally think that rule book is time definitely well spent, and you have to keep reinforcing it, but it does help drive change decisions later on, when invariably there will be something that comes up, but those rule books kind of take precedence. And and as you said, if a design change comes about that breaks those rules, then that's something that needs to be raised and agreed and made everyone aware, particularly the client aware, that that this has happened. But yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, from a designer's point of view, I think as an architect, you get different types. I mentioned this before. Different types of architects, different types of designers. Some of us like rules, some of us don't like rules, and I think that does play into this as well.
But there's it brings you back to that topic of standardization, doesn't it? And so many things seem to be moving in that way. But I know some of the architects that I've met with recently, I've talked about this, because I always expect a bit of a pushback when you say standardization, because it's kind of removing that ability to do one of the things that architects are great at doing and produce. But actually, surely it's perfectly possible to introduce standardization within a building, but ultimately the skin of the building, the look of the building, you're standardizing the things that we do day in, day out, rather than the facades, etc. It's there is room for it.
Yeah, I always joke in kind of internally that I always refer back to car design, and I always think I wonder what a car designed by architects would be, because we would be going back saying, how many wheels do we need? Do you know what I mean? It would be as basic as that. And looking at something like car design, those rules are established, but there is still design in that process. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing is, you're right there. I think the big thing is with car design, when you get into the readiness levels and stuff like that, it's an engineering-led process. It's like, it's similar, but it's slightly different. I think this is the main thing, and Mark's saying it himself, is that when you look at all these different, descriptive standards that are there, whether it's dampers, darks, flues, the rest of it, the standardization is actually in how you test it. You can't go away from the types of supporting construction that there, it's asymmetrical, so it's flexible, symmetrical, or rigid. What we're actually finding, what we're doing is that, one, we don't really understand the standardization in the first place. This is where the thing that you said, George, was good about who's actually responsible. Then we don't actually understand if we change something which is away from that, it actually goes into other, and you can still do it. We just got to identify, you got to just do something different and test something. That's all it is. But you never get to that point, because we never actually really know the products that are out there. We never really understand the support and construction they're compatible with, and actually the support and construction that is compatible with has got its own rule sets as well. And this is what's causing the big issue over movement, is that a wall's got to have a deflection head for it to be fire safe itself, and that's got to be compatible with the fire movement of the structure. Then you've got rigid walls are the same thing, and as soon as you've got those linear gap seals in the flexible or the concrete or rigid structures, the kit that's tested in those types of construction aren't tested with a linear gap seal. That's the problem. So the wall's got to have the linear gap seal, not the piece of kit you're putting into it. And that's what's actually pushing everything down. It's that simplistic issue that linear gap seals don't form part of the test for dampers, ducts, flues, and the rest of it. So as soon as you've got a linear gap seal, you've got more space required before you can put stuff through the wall. And that's the big bit that's very hard to it's not completely hard to generalize it. You just got to allow like 250 mil below every slab before you put a service through it. If you put that rule set into the market, it won't have a breakdown, because all your voids are gone already. But what it would do is drive out the fact that you need to look at maybe specific ways of getting kit to fit in a different way of testing. The manufacturers won't do it because it's not in the test standards. That's the kind of issue we're sort of living with at the moment.
I think to work on what everyone's been saying, by the looks of it, the way that kind of a design book or rules that have been put in at kind of like a stage 2 or a stage 3 is almost like managing risk rather than standardization, which you've got no risk then in it, or limited risk because you've already got your design that almost works. A design rule, it depends on where people want to pick that up from. For instance, stage 3, you're almost putting in placeholders what things would be in further design until it works into a kind of stage 4 or 5 technical design. And that's kind of the issue with that. I think someone put in the comments that if you've got the car industry, which they know what they're going to build from the beginning, they've got an engine that they can put in between 5 or 6 different variants of the same car. That should be the same with a house. I think a good example from one of my colleagues that you can have a bath as long as it's 700 mil long. You can have any bath as long as it's that's the size of it, and that's kind of the same mentality that should be used in construction.
So just to I think they've all been really kind of interesting kind of feedback. I think the from what I'm kind of getting here is that the reality of potentially employing or appointing all of the specialists is likely to be unlikely. I think we can sort of potentially say that, and maybe not even necessary. So I'm just kind of making some notes here that maybe on a project by project, I really like the rule book idea, and to be honest, in many ways, the architect as the lead coordinator should be driving on projects. We try and drive that. However, I think what that review might do, so I kind of wrote it here, it may be that actually project by project, you have a rule book which should be for, maybe for all school projects or office. However, on some projects, there may be other specialist elements of the design which actually does need a specific input. And that may be the role where the lead coordinator, the architect, for example, might say to the engineer, the M&E engineer, oh, actually, do we not need something like this? Do we need some input? Maybe that is a way to be less generic and more specific, and then therefore help explain that to the client in terms of their, cash flow risk management that we talked about before. So I don't know, that for me seems like maybe it's a compromise in that sense. But one thing I also, I think picking up on, I think what Jen was saying there is that I actually think that the designers can give various zones, etc. But actually, I find it really useful to get input from the installing maintenance teams, because it's easy to kind of get something to fit digitally in a model, but actually to kind of get it installed in real life and the things that you need for that / maintenance adds another layer of sort of tolerance, let's say, or a zonal requirement, which the designers themselves may not be aware of, for example. So they're the only kind of comment that I had on that. I'm just thinking in terms of looking at this time and going forward.
It's a good way of putting it that you would almost, it minimizes interpretation, which kind of, for instance, the building regs can be interpreted in different ways, and it's a good way of minimizing that, having a rule book that you kind of adhere to depending on the projects.
Exactly. I mean, like I said, in real life, we've had these workshops right at the beginning of the story, agreed the kind of floor build-ups, look at the roof build-up, a typical floor, and then the ground floor, for example. It's all signed off, agreed with the teams and the input that's currently available. But as you say, it's now changed, and that's either to do, like I said, with I think competency and general kind of input is a realistic thing there as well. We're told one thing, but actually, as it goes further down the line, more and more things come out. Well, we gave you the zone, but we didn't actually include for this because that's a specialist design, and we don't have that. So sprinkler design, for example.
I agree, but I do wonder actually if we're only repeating what we should all be doing anyway. In a way, it's and I did wonder whether what we've got here is actually us taking this to the next level, and we're trying to respond to the question. Whereas I'm interested whether everybody on the call agrees. If you were in an absolute perfect world, which is totally unachievable, do we agree as a basic principle that significantly it would be far better to complete the design before you started building, so we don't get into these heavy stage 4, stage 5 overlaps, so that we don't end up with the the joke of build and design. Because I mean, if you think about it, if you buy a set of shelves from IKEA, it doesn't come with a set of instructions with another guy coming along still writing the instructions as you start to build it. So I mean, I know it's a little bit out there, but as a group, do we agree that actually we should be trying to get the design completed?
I think that's heavily reliant on standardization.
I'm loving the standardization chat. It always sounds the same. Guys, you cannot compare something that comes out of the ground with something that's coming out of a pristine factory on a repetitive hundreds of thousands of sort of unit basis. Every project will be slightly different. I think a lot of architects are already working on creating let's call them systems or platforms rather than individual projects. There's no debate about that. So a lot of people are already on board. It's how predictable everything within, let's call them platforms. That's the sort of I think that's one of the agreed names. So let's say we have 2 or 3 platforms to build schools and 2 or 3 platforms to build housing. Yeah, and everyone, all suppliers, all contractors plug into those platforms and everyone knows what they're doing. Yeah, let's say we arrive at that amazing world, which is difficult, but something to aim for. At every single stage, as soon as something changes, everything else has to change to adapt to that, and that is design. It is very hard to design that out. So a classic example would be, as soon as a type of structure changes, there might be downstairs that you haven't accounted for, therefore everything else will change. And the structure might change because you're trying to VE some really genuine cost out of the project. So I think we need to be realistic that there are gateways, and that we just fix ourselves to those gateways and then try and fix only those things that are still being questioned at that gateway, if that makes sense. And then if we can arrive at the perfect world where platforms are already agreed and everyone is using the same suppliers and they know how things are fitted, then fantastic.
I think
realistically we're just pushing it. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of Mark, your question, I think we are all agreed that the design should be completed at the end of stage 4, because that's what the gateway is asking for. Obviously, we'll come on to this sort of change management thing. I think the question here, and in terms of the standardization platforms, the more we can kind of create assemblies that are repeatable, also really, and that will be part of that design development up to stage 4. I think the question here that we can't answer, or I can't certainly answer at the moment, is how do we get the input that we need from other parties which are not part of the core team, let's say, at the right time. And for me, that is sort of this idea of a client procurement team managing risk cash flow, and the gateway number 2 being the really useful hard stop in a way, even though it's a bit of a soft stop from what we can see, using that as a hard stop to identify to the client, this is why certain input is needed by certain specialists to enable us to complete the design by the end of stage 4. So if that's, I'm conscious of time as well, and the 2 other things we want to go through, but it's the question that we're really asking input from the other working teams is about their internal discussions that they had themselves to date, about how much can the procurement route change, how much can our clients willing to expend potentially more money to meet the requirements of the gateways, how the nuances of the details, and whether, and you're right, I think, Mark, I think in a way we should be doing all of this, a lot of this kind of coordination. The thing that it stops us being able to complete it is having that specific input at the right time, because that costs money ultimately. So I think if you're all agreement to that, we can then move on. I can sort of type up or try and rephrase the question that we can then send, and it'd be useful to kind of feel like who who from the other working teams, in terms of whether it's just client or procurement or manufacturing, etc., need to be part of that working group. Does that summarise?
Can I just ask one? In terms of the rule book, are we really talking about real prescription? Because as I'm more involved in the standardization of fire precaution arrangements, they are getting more choices within the standard, which require stakeholder intervention up front. They're getting less prescriptive. I'll give you an example. There's a new SEN standard coming out regarding escape route signs, and they are changing the height to 3 meters, whereas the British standard is 2 meters, to make sure that the escape sign is below the smoke line. Well, you know, that one choice requires people to be involved as stakeholders, and that is normally after the emergency lighting's gone in. And I've got a case of hospital at the moment where every sign is a back illuminated sign. Just think of the absolute waste of energy and maintenance charges, a 3 months discharge test on everything over every exit door, and nobody can tell me the reason. So I'm very much into prescription, because I honestly think it's the way to achieve the objectives. But in the standardization process today, both internationally and domestically, we're given loads of choices, and it's right up front in the standards to tell you who should be involved in that decision making. And that's why I'm on the design side of this meeting.
Jim, I think one of the issues with standardization generally, ISO standardization internationally, from what I understand, because there are so many different stakeholders in different countries. Yeah.
What are you going to say? I sit there every day, and we have to get consensus. And that's
so the maybe from our perspective, our community is saying this is how we're going to work. Yeah. And therefore, if we can say that to actually achieve the objectives, our recommendation is that we actually work in this more prescriptive way.
Yeah, well, that's really that answers my question, George. Yes, we are recommending that. Is everybody agreed that we go to a more prescriptive regime for building?
Can I add to it? Sorry for barging in. You're right, Jim, by saying the standards becoming less prescriptive, and I think it's part of the modular approach to design and having ability to, I don't know, be more maybe creative and so on, and because it's at international level. But I think what we also discussed in the past, just trying to capture what everyone said, we've mentioned lessons learned, and I think it will be handy if we link the gateways for checking whatever progress, quality, and so on. If we link the gateways to lessons learned to show the client specifically that if this is not done, then that's most likely going to happen. So a negative kind of impact would snap the attention of the possible bad outcomes. I'm specifically concentrating on bad outcomes because they tend to snap attention more than positive outcomes. And yeah, and also just mention what Dad said about the maintenance learning from as to adding to rule book. In my opinion, the rule book is not another standard or collection of standards, is more of kind of practical linked to lessons learned, what's going to happen. And then, for example, talking about maintenance, sorry for jumping about a little bit, talking about maintenance in relation to BIM aspect, asset information requirements. This is something which is generally agreed to be missing at any project. And that's very important. And that should be part of the rule book. And if it's there, we can make a use out of information, even establish the equipment, because the client may actually have a specific needs for equipment. And if that is there, then it's the risk is reduced. If it's not there, the risk will increase, because at stage 3 or 4, the design is still not complete, or at 4 is still not complete. And then specialists are changing equipment, and then nothing fits. And that can be part of lessons learned and demonstrated to the client. If this is not happen, then most likely outcome is that, and that could help. I don't know.
Can I add one thing to this listing from the outside view? Is that descriptive, prescriptive, and George knows I'm always harping on about this, right? There's a bit of an issue, I think, just on what people see descriptive, what people see prescriptive. Like, so if you took, electrically slightly different to ventilation, which is different to pipe work and hydraulics, so you've got to sort of separate this out a little bit. So, and I'm going to ask Jim to come back on this, because I think it's quite important. Is that if you took, I use a fire damper because it's the best one to use. The descriptive of a fire damper is a combination of the risk of the building, whether it's a sleeping risk or non-sleeping risk. So that will affect the classification of the descriptive what you select. So if it's a sleeping risk, you can't just go for an E category, which is integrity only. You've got to go for an E and a smoke leakage one, because you don't want the smoke risk spreading through the building. That's the first thing. Then the rating of it is the rating of the compartment to which it protects, and so on and so forth on that descriptive basis. The prescriptive of it is how it fits in the wall as well. And that prescriptive is affected by the product manufacturer and what's been tested, because there's a range of different ways of installing them depending on the range the manufacturers make. So that prescriptive is actually definable by getting the descriptive right, as in E&S terminology. The volume's obviously the volume of air, but the E and the S will have a big effect on how that volume's delivered, because an E is 100% free area, an ES is a posed blade. You might get 60% free area maximum out of it, so the duct's going to be potentially 40% smaller than it should be. So this is the descriptive part that goes wrong a lot of the time as well. Then the prescriptive is X manufacturer makes a damper that performs that descriptive function, but its installation requires a gap around it of 100 mil or 6 mil or 10 mil, and the wall thickness could be 100 mil up to 130 mil to make that product work. That's the prescriptive, which is specific to the manufacturer and how they test it in the test standard. So if you take your emergency lighting example, there'll be some of that involved at that scalability as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the purpose. I mean, I go back. I'm old enough to remember the purpose groups in buildings when the BRE used to be there. So I'm not conversant with the technology as you are, but again, I always go back to basics on the difference between a sleeping risk and a standard risk. And bearing in mind, we were talking about how things interface and stuff like that. I would always, if I'm going to be asked to analyze it, really go back to basics, why there is a difference between a sleeping risk and an ordinary risk, because it's data that I would normally want to see as a function of, now, because somebody may say that, well, people are asleep, they're not aware of smoke. If that's the full justification for it, then I would want to see that as a standards, so that we can see that something has occurred in the past where we've now got to use better technology. This is in the value engineering side of things, and the same applies in emergency lighting. Emergency lighting has gone completely overkill now. We need a luminaire over every piece of equipment according to the guide or to the standard, over every piece. And as I say, I keep going back to why those differences are there, because, well, you can tell me, why is the difference between a sleeping risk and any other risk as far as that technology is concerned? Is it just cost?
Jim?
Jim,
sorry, Jim. I'm very conscious that Daz is trying to obviously try and get through these. I think what we've discussed here is great, and I think that we need to capture it. There is one point I'd just like to make that I've learned just this week, from a conversation that I had with one of the door manufacturers who was at DCW. I was talking to him about the test standards, which is what you've been referring to, Paul. And one of the things that I was trying to understand was if Warrington Fire have done a test on one of their door assemblies, then is that information available in terms of what the test conditions were or the field of application? Is that available to anybody? Is it available to, for example, the client or the maintenance organization? And the door manufacturer explained that it wasn't. Yeah, that's not available because it's commercially sensitive. So I said, well, if it's the case that that particular test is conditional on the wall it's gone into, what the wall it was tested with, and the ironmongery that was used, and the door closer that was used, is that the case? Is it the case that if you swapped, for example, the hinges out for something else, that test is no longer valid? And he said, yes. I said, but you're not providing the information as to what the hinges are. And he said, no. And we went round in circles. I mean, this is somebody that's very keen to help and be supportive. But one of the concerns that they've got is that one of their competitors could then see what type of hinges they're actually using. And therefore, that could be used against them. Now, I get the impression that this is very common. And therefore, in terms of standardization, one of the things that I think we do need to get to is the data standardization, so that we can make sure that, for example, the means by which these tests are done, all of the questions that are asked need to be consistent. But, who gets that information? If, for example, somebody turns around and says, we get a data sheet, do you get a data sheet about that particular installed door in that location with what equipment that was on it? So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in because it surprised me that the information that seems to be safety critical is secret.
Do you know, Jules, we did the CPA stuff with Sibsy, not part of this group, but we brought this up because it was about the compatibility of all the other stuff that goes onto it, including the substrates. And I think a door's a bit of a nuanced example because you've got other componentry on it. If you take things like, I don't know, pipe work or buzz bar or flues or dampers, it's all that information you can generally get it out. You can't get it out. The DOP was my complaint, which is what you're saying about the DOP does not tell you enough information to tell you the whole performance in a declaration.
Yeah,
and that's where the issue lies. But also there's a general, I think it's not so much a lack of knowledge. I think you got to look at it from the manufacturer's point of view, and there is a big problem with having stuff stolen because you invest a load of money and time in how things pass. And if you can see what the thermocouples are doing in the test, you can kind of go, if I replicate that, I know I'm going to pass. So that you remove the R&D from there and you've stolen it. That's where they will get worried. You don't see it so much now in the damper world because essentially they're all pretty similar anyway, George, to be honest with you. All the bit that we need is the thickness and the density and the gap seals that go with it. So that bit's become a bit easier to get hold of. But you are right. You go back to the data sets. All of that stuff needs to be in the digital data set so you can select things accordingly. Otherwise, you've got no hope, have you? I'm with you.
Absolutely. Daz, take control again, please.
That's fine. Well, I think it leads on to this the second one quite well about the change management, because that's a good example, isn't it, of being able to swap something through. So then the second question that we were, I think we were kind of agreed in terms of the topic, was about this sort of this change management process. And obviously, if we stick to our original statement that we just made, that we did want the design to be completed at stage 4, then again, theoretically, change shouldn't come into it. But I think it's clear. I think, in being realistic, some things will change not purely from just a cost point of view, but from something that is completely unforeseen, or we couldn't have predicted, which requires a change of some sort. So I think the questions that that I kind of wrote before, I think again, Mark, you kind of came back to me on this one, I think Jared as well, was about just understanding what is this sort of major and notifiable change. I think it's the extract that you had sent through to us. So I guess if you know what the definitions of those are, which this is being sent down here, it's kind of saying that the approach to categorizing major and notified change will be set out. I assume that hasn't, I don't know if that's come out or that is due to come out, but I guess that's an output of the work stream that'd be useful to know, so that everyone is clear about what is a major, what is a notifiable, so that can also be sort of managed. I guess the reality is that if you know what is a notifiable change and what that time period is from for that to occur, or a major change, then that may give some scope for tweaking or kind of finalizing elements.
I think the problem is they haven't issued,
They haven't released it, have they?
A secondary legislation or the guidance to identify major, minor, or notifiable change. We do know the timescales. And we started running scenarios on something internally, and I said, well, we can't really run the scenarios because we don't actually know what a major change is. I mean, you could take I don't know, take the list of items that's been put together by this group of people or others, and I think you had 10 or 11 items: fire stopping, AOVs, compartmentation, etc. You could just take any change at all to those as a major change.
Mm.
Yeah, I think the way I looked at it, Mark, was structural fire safety and other regulatory prescribed hazards are those that are reserved for people's competency is assured. So you sit there and you go, a major change is going to be something structurally. It's going to be something like a change in principle of smoke control, a change in principle of evacuation. It will be those ones there. The minor stuff will come down to silly things like you've got the wrong type of damper or the wrong type of wall. Do you know what I mean? And this is where I kind of described it in another thing recently and said that, if you actually ask everyone, even in this group, how do you think Gateway 2 is going to roll and when it's going to end? Where does everyone think Gateway 2 ends? As an example, does it end at the end of stage 4? Or does it end when you go to handover at Gateway 3?
No,
Paul, this is something we like to debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because to me, Gateway 2 is a milestone, not a duration.
Yeah. There's a Gateway. I think you're right, Paul. It has to be a milestone because it's what allows you to commence on site. And then there's a period in between Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 where there is another whole bunch of processes where this change would be occurring, and then you have a Gateway 3 milestone.
Because the reason, and good to see you there, Paul. I didn't see you was hiding in the background there, mate. Good to see you again, mate. It was the big thing is that you got to look at this in a practical approach, because it's no big secret, I think, to anyone that even with building control, they're not as good as they probably were 20 years ago because they've got no liability for designer for no financial interest, so they don't know it all either. So if you submit, there's no way in this earth anyone's ever going to submit a completed stage 4, especially after this conversation, where every nook and cranny is completely designed out when you haven't got products. So you're going to see it's going to end up being a phased approach where you'll go, there's the structure, there's the internals with the doors, there's the wall types, and they may do some checks to go if it looks like it's all the right ratings, but they're not telling you it's all compatible together. And that's where this change process, which is still part of Gateway 2, is going to be the nightmare that is, the nightmare before the next Christmas when it comes in. You can see it coming a mile off because we'll get to this.
The problem is we just don't know, do we? I mean, there's the argument over what's practical, but are we doing that in the context of what we've become used to as an industry, or are we looking at something that's completely different? And I mean, it's interesting, Paul, what you say, where you see major, minor, and notifiable, but you could conceive it from a worst case scenario. You could say that You are going to specify canal dry lining system to achieve whatever fire rating you need, and that's easy enough to do. But then obviously, or usually, somewhere along the line, someone comes in and says, yeah, but we'll go to British Gypsum, and I assume that none of these guys are on the call, but would that be a major change or a minor change? We don't know.
I think it comes down. I mean, the internal walls is a brilliant one. So I've been talking to FS about this. Is that there's still drywall companies out there that are using Speedline, Canaf board, and screws from B&Q, and you go, it's madness because the wall's still got to be accredited in its own right. So I think if you go from a major manufacturer that's got all the information, and you go to another manufacturer, I think that might end up getting sucked in building controls eyes as a major change until they understand, because they don't understand that if it's BG, Canaf or Cinet, they're all linear to the same test standard. They don't know that at the moment. I had this conversation with one of the boroughs in London. They just didn't know. So it's going to come down to their knowledge. And if their knowledge at the moment is as bad as we all kind of think it is, or suspect it is, the stuff that should be minor could end up getting sucked into major, Mark. And that wall one could be one that gets sucked into it. Though I'd probably treat it as a minor change. They might treat it as a big change.
Yeah.
And that's the risk in itself on the education piece, because the industry is just not educated, is it? Let's be controversial and honest about it.
Mark,
talking about.
Oops, sorry, Paul. I was just going to say the timescales. What is the ones that we're aware of at the moment in terms of what's been released? Just to kind of finish my notes on that one.
I think, am I right in saying a major change is 4 weeks? A notifiable change is, I think, 14 days. And I can't remember whether there's actually something defined as minor or not.
Yeah, I thought they were talking bigger time frame than that, but
I think in the clipping that you sent through, it just talks about major changes will require building code before they can be made. Other changes must be notified. So they just said other changes. So they haven't really used the word.
I mean, it's interesting. A lot of things I pick up from the likes of Pinsent Mason and various other legal people. I often wonder where they're getting their information from, but they're saying very definitively over some of these timescales. So I've definitely seen the 4 weeks and the 14 days.
Yeah, I mean, I need to see. We've got them coming in soon, Pints and Masons. We're trying to arrange it at the moment to go through some stuff on legal as well. So I'd see what their view is. It might be worth me talking to Trow and Hamlets as well, see what Rebecca's view on life is at the moment. Yeah. Well, they've released some good stuff. So
if you've got the opportunity to ask Paul as well, I mean, it'd be interesting to pick up on something they said recently, where I was, maybe I'd take the worst case scenario and everything, but it served me well to this point. I was of the mind that, in terms of transitional arrangements, that actually, if a project had already started, that you could still result in actually going through Gateway 3, even though you hadn't done the Gateway 2 sign-off as such. But they made a comment on a recent piece saying they were expecting that would not happen as such. You would carry on under the old or the current regime, as such.
Yeah. There was that. There was if you've got a building where there was 2 things that I've taken from it recently, Mark. One was that if you're doing a work at the moment, it gets handed over a week after it all kicks in. That they're not going to follow the new regime. They're going to follow the old one. But you got to read between the lines. Is that Hackett's already said everyone should just be doing this by default anyway. So this is I've explained this to the business as well, is that if you're doing a project where the regulator is not going to be involved, if you don't follow the same process yourself and it all goes wrong, and the regulator does get involved, you've got to be able to demonstrate the same thing. So the point I was always told to me is that this applies to every building, not just in scope, everything. So don't treat it just like in scope, everything.
And I totally agree with you, because I'm definitely of the mind that most of what we talk about here, we should already have been doing.
Yeah,
You know, things haven't grown up that way, but we should already. So we need to be refining things that are already in place for the vast majority of us. But it's the only reason my particular interest for it. It changes the risk profile for the scheme, because if you know that you have to physically pass through Gateway 3 before you can essentially practically complete because you can't occupy, and you know that potentially the building safety regulator may well be overloaded, I would be slightly concerned whether the, let's say, 12 weeks that we thought was going to occur for Gateway 3 turns into 25 weeks.
I think you're going to get a bit. I think, Mark, what's going to happen is of all of this stuff, it's like, you know, even in contracts where they say the employer's got 14 days to respond, and you sort of go, it depends on the level of a complication of what's been submitted.
Yeah.
Because some stuff that gets submitted, you know, we all want in the world. It's like if you know, take the example, if you submitted everything, A, B, C, all the different parts of building regs in one hit, do you think you're really going to get a response from the regulator in 14 days? No chance. Hence the reason why they've always said, even on the website, there'd be a phased approach where you do structure, then you the way you did it before. But the risk of that is they won't, not just the risk of it, is the reality of it really is that, you know, we've struggled ourselves in the industry to describe this problem that we've all got, and Paula knows this, you know this, Mark, we all do, because there's an education piece around all the different thousands, as George, you say, 900 things that support just the approved document, to, you know, to put it into reality, you know, what you're actually looking at and understanding all of it. You know, the regulator ain't going to know 10% of what we know at the moment. You know what I mean? And that's the risk of reality.
There's one important thing, which is Regulation 38 under building regulations, which means that, you know, before, when we did have a little bit of a statutory bar and we could go back to building control, we can't now, because the fire safety order still from day one of occupation is that everything needs to be reviewed. So that file, that Regulation 38 file, which was M&E, but now is extended to all the fire safety arrangements, including compartmentation, needs to be maintained. Now, as I say, the thing is, then it goes back to contractors, because the contractor, by virtue of contract, can be liable for stuff that has been done prior to building control signing off. So with Grenfell, and I am absolutely disgusted that no one has actually been prosecuted, because the legislation was robust enough. It was robust enough to go back to individual people by virtue of contract for some of the things they did, specifically in design. There was one young lad that was given the job in design for some of the upkeep that was woefully over his competency criteria. So, as I say, from that perspective, the legislation, even the new fire safety bill, and you're quite right, it's for every building, comes back to individuals that actually put a screw in a piece of batten, if you like, if they want it. The strength is there. So I am really surprised that it hasn't happened before, but I'm sure it'll happen in the future.
Yeah.
I think the oops, sorry, I'm just saying, I think the question in this particular one, the questions / clarifications that we seek are still out there. Again, I don't know who, you know, maybe the legal team might be able to help because they may have some other input or knowledge. Maybe we can get some input from George. I know you got the gentleman who's looking after the this department itself to try and get some input in terms of things like, you know, just a submission process. For example, I wrote here, is it like planning where they submit it, validate it, and then the time starts? Or is it meant to be more fluid than that? So
yeah, I can probably help. Steve Coppin is being very helpful. So if I can get a summarized set of questions, then I can run through that with him. The other point that is that I've got, as you know, good connections in the Devonshires. I also know Pinsent Mason very well. So if there are the questions that Mark's just been asking there, if we could get a summary of of what those questions are, then I can put them to several different lawyers, and let's see.
Warren Spencer part of Pinsits? Warren Spencer has done a number of talks for the FIA on the new fire safety bill.
Yeah, I recognise that name, but I don't know whether he's part of Pinsent Mason. But I mean, certainly we can talk to, that's something that would be good just to have as a bit of a summary that we can ask several different. There's also Wombles. Do you know Wombles? I can't remember the name of it's a big firm. It's
based in Wimbledon.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, I mean,
No doubt, we're all thinking the same thing, Mark. It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it does. Yeah, it's an American firm, and I've joked with them on that, but it's frustrating for them in the UK because that's exactly what everybody thinks. But the reason I'm mentioning them is that the Simon Lewis that leads the legal part of GTI, Golden Thread Initiative, is from Wombles. So I shouldn't call them Wombles, but it's the memorable bit in their name.
Yeah, they need to rebrand in the UK, I think.
Yeah.
I think that'd be great, George. So I'll kind of leave the kind of the main questions because it's more about workflow, isn't it, and process. And as you say, Mark, trying to, as a client or a contractor, to be able to put those periods in as you would do normally for, let's say, planning, to kind of keep that kind of realistic program back to the client and build in a buffer if required. So so I think that'd be quite useful. So then we've got about 20 minutes left just to look at the final question, which was sort of really around the idea of some of the documents that they talked about in there as well, and also just aligning how do we go around aligning the kind of responsibilities of the team. So what was it? Just trying to have a look here. I think there was two. Yeah, so one of the things I've noticed is the sort of disconnect in various documents, contractual documents or appointment documents, which aren't necessarily very clear, and they're not necessarily using a baseline sort of standard or a classification system to define it. I think this, so for example, what I've seen is like the scope not aligning to the BIM execution plan, not aligned to the design responsibility matrix. I don't know if there's any good examples of how that's been kind of realigned. Probably a requirement for the different teams within those organizations to kind of review it. And I think as you go here, Jared, looking in detail at like the EIR and the BIM execution plans, just to make sure things are aligned and we do know what we're meant to be delivering at what stage. And I think the last thing was to do with like the as-built sort of obviously or final record drawings, etc., which I think Mark you commented on here.
Yeah, I think for me that's a huge focus, because it's that change from what we've been used to and people have been used to signing up to in terms of producing from a consultant point of view, construction record or final construction or final record drawings, and normally any as-built comes from some of the specialists, to actually moving over to no, we actually need to provide an as-built drawing, and somebody needs to consider how can we get enough confidence through that build process for ultimately an individual, probably an organisation, to sign it off and say this is as-built.
Exactly, because I think and again the documents that are written, there are a couple of statements or phrases that they've used, like fire statement, construction control plan, fire and emergency files, change control strategy, and the as-built drawings. Again, I don't know if there are templates for these which have been issued, because these are phrases that I extracted from the guidance that was sort of that was in the gov.uk website. So I think that, again, I don't know if anyone's had an experience of that or exposure, but I think that will be useful for us. And if they haven't developed it, then obviously that's a question that we can ask back to the building safety regulator. Well, are you going to provide some structure or around what these constitute as? For example, construction control plan or change control strategy must be linked to obviously what we just discussed about what is a major and a notifiable, for example. But I don't know.
Have we got anyone on this call who's from an FM background, or anyone part of the panel? Because I think we almost need to work backwards from what they need to establish whether the building's working safely for them, and if not, what other information do we need to provide? At the minute, we're still churning out Kobe data almost like a cut and paste requirement. Is that the format it needs to be in? Is there a more user-friendly format? What do they really need to know from a building safety perspective? We need to look at it from the end user point of view and then adapt accordingly, I think.
Yeah, I can certainly contribute on that, Paula, because obviously I'm working with the big asset management companies, and I think one of the things that we're doing at the moment, we've started some work actually with Wilmot Dixon, is to look at how the new fiery information can actually be delivered in a way that means that it's not separate, it's part of Kobe. Yeah, because actually it is Kobe. It's just a number of different attributes that have been added, plus some useful additional data sets like competency and things like that. And I've got a slide that can show that if anybody's interested. Maybe rather than impose on today, I could set up another brief session on that, so we could cover that. But I think you're absolutely right that we need to look at that from what's being delivered and then work back up again. So maybe we arrange another session for anybody that's interested in that, maybe next week or the week after or something like that for an hour, and we can go through it.
Well, I think we've got the next session probably, I think, in a couple of weeks' time, or maybe that's the beginning of the maybe not a couple of weeks' time. I can never remember. Time seems to kind of just flow. Yeah. But that would be great, George, as the intro for the next session. The usual kind of bi-monthly one.
I think the challenge is, Paula, that what has become very clear is that when we talk about the FM team, you're actually looking at a similarly complex group as the construction team. Actually, you've got so many different stakeholders. You've got people that are bothered about compliance, asset management, planned maintenance, reactive maintenance, and they all have got different needs. And therefore, what we need to do is to try and make sure that we can accommodate all of them.
And different competencies as well, George. So some people will be really up with the digital 3D format of information. Other people will still want to get dusty volumes of drawings out of cupboards. So how do we upskill and identify that level of competency on a project by project basis and kind of appeal to the middle ground, if you like?
Yeah, definitely.
The other thing I'm pretty hot on, and sorry if I should know, but this one is for you, Andrew, is that I've had some experience on theoretically fire and emergency files, because I've been advocating the premises information boxes for complicated buildings for years. And I found that even though the Fire and Rescue Authority have got keys to these boxes, their expectation for what they actually would like in them varies absolutely wildly differently in terms of their description of the things that they would like in the box itself. So I wouldn't mind seeing what the definition is of a fire and emergency files, and then I may be able to help in that regard.
That'd be great, Jim.
It's an interesting point, because you don't expect there to be a laptop in there with a fully functioning 3D model with all the information in it, do you?
Well, funny enough, believe it or not, the idea is just to change it to a QR code that you can scan and have access. So there is stuff being done now in the cloud in terms of, but again, it comes back to the definition of what they want, because if it takes 3/4 of an hour to go through a control box, like, you know, to find out exactly what you want first and second and third in an emergency, it is a really detailed thing. But I don't exactly know what you mean at the moment. As I say, I certainly know that if they turned up with a complete set of plans, most fire and rescue deployment officers wouldn't actually know where to start.
So I think I think George, I think you made the point before. I think only George, where actually they just want a very simple diagrammatic plan, because in the heat of the moment, that's all you need. That's all you can focus on, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Joe's got his hand up.
Just one kind of observation, kind of based on experience of this handover process, particularly around as-built information and handing over COBie information, is the kind of understanding exactly when that information should be collated and handed over. So traditionally, there's a big push, isn't there, for as-built or as final construction issue, whatever it may be, for handover and occupation. Whereas in reality, a lot of building owners, you know, there's a 12-month defect from that time onwards, and the building owner isn't interested in that data for that 12 months, quite rightly, because the contractor is liable, you know, to change and service and maintain parts. So even if we get that record 100% right at handover, the odds on it being 100% right 12 months later are extremely slim. So, you know, even with our best efforts, that data is potentially out of date, as, you know, items will have failed or been replaced or whatever during that 12 months. So
is there not there's a life beyond Gateway 3, isn't there? And I have to admit, because of where I sit in the process, I haven't looked at this closely, but there is a need to continue that safety case going forward with a I can't remember whether the period of time, but every
5 years.
Is it? Yeah.
No, definitely. And I would support exactly what Joe's said there. The only thing, Joe, is that you do need both data drops. The reason for that is that it probably will take the asset management team maybe 6 months to plan and mobilize how they're actually going to do the maintenance. So therefore, they do need that handover data set. Arguably, they need it earlier than that, and there's no reason why they shouldn't get it earlier than that in terms of what assets have gone into the building. But I think you're absolutely right that at the end of the defect period, that should be a version of that's a revision, probably.
I mean, from our perspective, what I'm pushing for is to kind of extend our service, and I think other consultants should be doing so beyond handover. You know, I'm kind of describing it as an aftercare period. You know, it's soft landings, isn't it? Really, revisited.
Yeah. And arguably, it's something that architects, you know, the post-occupancy evaluation stuff is obviously an important thing. But the trouble is, you know, I was talking to one of the directors years ago of BDP, and they put post-occupancy evaluation into every scheme, and it always gets struck out.
Yeah, I'd concur.
For value engineering.
Exactly. Most of the time it's not. No one actually knows. No one defines what the requirement is in that period. But as you say, George, sometimes that practical completion data drop is required, because if someone does change something within that 12-month, they need that the baseline strategy to kind of change a door against, because I think we've seen it before where you know, someone will put a door in which might be 60 minutes rather than 30 minutes, which is what is required, just because they've got it or they've got access to it, and then that starts to change the entire baseline design that all further changes or future changes should be assessed against. So I think that was really cool. So is there anything, I guess, any other major questions, I guess, and I'll share these notes sort of as they are, to be honest. And if you could think of any other any other work stream input teams that we think might be best suited to answer this, that'd be great. So if anyone's got any other major item to add into it before we close up.
Yeah, Mark.
So again.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mark, could you give me an explicit set of questions that we need to ask the lawyers?
Oh, yes, of course, yeah.
If you do that, then I can.
Yeah, it's only a couple of items, but yeah, no problem at all.
Brilliant, thank you.
I was just gonna say there for you, Andrew, as well, is that one of the big things you've got the fire things there, fire statement, and I think Mark's just put the thing in the. I remember that thing's been issued out as well. The construction control plan, the rest of this stuff. There is the government fact sheets on the website that tells you certain things. It doesn't tell you everything. The only thing I'd say on change control process and what you were talking about on appointments above is that the biggest issue that you see at the moment in the industry is that when you look at the forms of contract that get issued, and it's like if you look at a major project form, the way the language works, if you're not familiar with it, it's always worth, if you need a conversation, having a conversation, because if you understand that an NPC puts the responsibility of the requirements in the adequacy, the everything discrepancy back on the employer, sounds really good until you realise that all the information that you get in the tender, which is all the consultant's job drawings and specs, form the proposals for which the contractor is responsible for the adequacy of all of that. You then realise that the requirements is a one page and the rest of it's your bag because it's design and build for the back door, and it's understanding what that actually is in definition in the first place. So when you start getting your head around all of that, you look at definitions in main contracts, scheduler services of consultants, it's like the alignment's not always there. So you can't always tell actually who's responsible for what anyway, because DRM is a fantastic thing. It doesn't supersede the obligations of what's in the wording of the scheduler services in the first place. So all of this nuance already exists, which is going to complicate matters more. So when you start coming down to change control, it's covered in JCT D&B under Schedule 1, and it's covered in, I think, NPC under something like Clause 12 or 13. It's the same wording, but understanding how that process is supposed to work in legal terms kind of makes it a bit easier to understand how it's probably going to work with a regulator. It's quite interesting when you look at the comparisons to what you're probably going to find it's going to say. I think you've never seen any of that, Andrew. I can forward over a load of useless information that will probably blow your brains, but it's good to understand how that kind of stuff works in sheer legal flow anyway, because I think I was joking with Mark on one of the other things before that, the issue is that you're going to have a regulator beating the crap out of you, and you're also going to have a client's lawyer beating the crap out of you when it all goes wrong.
Yeah.
Just one point on that client's lawyer. One of the things reading that word fire statement and remembering that most of the building managers now boards would, and I always remember this being on a number of boards in the past, how the directors were expected to make statements about what they wanted out of their resources and out of their building and out of their staff, specifically to do with the management of health and safety, whether it might help justify some of the upfront design costs on experts for fire safety arrangements. The list is given to the managing director of a company to ask them, what their thoughts are in respect to whether they want zero tolerance or what I call minimum requirement.
I'll get your point.
If you could send those links, that'd be great, especially to the any kind of guidance on these items as well, because it's always useful for everyone to kind of see. Because I don't think I've necessarily seen that myself. So and I guess one final before we just close up. Mark, are you doing anything? I guess just within Boyd, for example, to somehow I don't know, recheck the alignment of these kind of documents?
Oh, right. So DRM, absolutely, yes. That's an ongoing process. Not necessarily, wholly driven by what we're talking about here, but it is something that is ongoing as such. In terms of the BIM side of things, this is always where I end up making myself look a bit of an idiot. But sort of the big discussion is about really transitioning properly over to 19650 and embedding unit class into everything, and actually also in terms of our DRM. So there's some challenges there, but we're certainly working on that. I don't mind sharing with you as well in that obviously we have a development side to our business. We have a slightly different way of working now. So actually people within my team, we're looking at a particular development opportunity, and we are reviewing it on a worst case scenario in terms of my worst case scenario I was talking about earlier, where we need to substantially conclude elements of stage 4. And actually we've programmed that out, looked at the implications, we've cash flowed it out. It's going to the board just to discuss, actually look at the implications of all this cash flow that's been pushed pre-FC. So that's probably about as much as I can say about that. But yeah, we're really starting to think about these things.
That's really cool, and it's interesting. I think what right here about the idea of using some sort of classification as the base datum, and it doesn't have to be Uniclass, but something to tie those sort of 3 main documents that I'm conscious of, that there are sometimes variations, i.e. the DRM, the scope, and some other documents like within the AIR.
The topic of DRM in itself is fascinating, because we've started looking at all sorts of people's DRMs, from different businesses, from people's backgrounds, and everybody's got a slightly different take and flavour on it. Some people take it on the it's almost a gap filling exercise for your scopes, through to people that are dealing with it more like a kind of, I suppose I'd call it like a BIM mindset, and looking at level of detail and level of information. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure which is right.
No, Mark, it's interesting you say it, because I think, for all the architects in the room here, this is the fundamental issue, I think, with DRMs, is that if you've drawn a building out generically without any products, then you go into novation to a contractor and they say, here's all the products, go away and redraw it. You're going to say straight away, well, our fee doesn't cover that, because you've already spent the money, right? And this is one of the biggest problems that you kind of find in it all, because when I've got jobs I'm looking at a tender at the moment where you look at all the life safety, you've got goods lists being used for evacuation purposes in cause because of the London plan, then you read it into more detail. They've got a fire curtain at ground floor because it's within the protected entrance for the fire brigade, and none of this stuff actually statutorily works, but the main contract actually says I'm going to be liable for all of that crap in the end. So you go, why the hell would I sign that contract? But no one wants to say anything, because everyone thinks there's a solution to the risk. The risk isn't a risk, it's actually a fundamental non-compliance with statutory requirements. You know what I mean? So you look at all of this stuff and you sort of go, when you look at liability and how you proportion it, you can do as much as you want in a DRM, but if fundamentally it's not adequate, it's not adequate. The job. You're not going to remove that problem. You're going to set yourself on an adventure you're going to fail on from day one. That's a courageous conversation with a client who wants to have. Yeah,
it's just trying, as I say, it's trying to, where possible, reduce ambiguity. I'm sure there'll be some ambiguity that retains. But the more we can reduce it, the better it's for everyone, isn't it? So you kind of take out that element of ambiguity, which then typically leads to, heated discussions, etc. But look, I think I don't know if anyone else. What I'll do is, I'll share these notes that I've just taken. Please take some time to kind of add anything that you might want, and then that could then feed into. And George, just going forward in terms of work streams, I've tried to kind of identify some of the input that we may need from whichever working party. I guess that may get more refined in the next, as with people's input. So does it make sense from, I don't know, maybe just a conversation with you at some point to then agree who may be best placed to answer these questions, and then that gets sort of formally sent out to that team? Is that how it's worked before in the other streams?
Yes, that would be ideal. Yeah.
Okay.
So
cool.
Do you Daz, do you have any time later today? Just probably 15 minutes or so.
I'm sure I can find something. So let me just have a quick look. Yeah, should we say something like, I don't know, like 3 o'clock or something? If you want to give me a ring, or the better one would maybe be tomorrow afternoon. Is the other time, sort of around about 4 o'clock tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm struggling with that. I'll try and get back to you if I may later on this afternoon.
Give me a ring on the mobile, and then if I answer, I'll answer. If I don't, I don't.
Okay. Thank you, Daz. See ya.
Well, look, thanks everyone. Thanks for your input.
Thank you. Bye.
See you
Thank
soon,
you very
guys.
much.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Cheers all.
Bye, everyone.